Hello, everybody. I'm the coach Shannon Griffith, and welcome to the Hoosier Football Tailgate right here on the Believe Network and sponsored by Bet Online. Remember, betonline.ag is where you can find all your information for college football, NFL football with up-to-date stats, news, and breakdowns as well. Remember, Bet Online is where the game starts. And thank you for that sponsorship by Bet Online. Well, the Hoosiers are back into game week after having a bye week this past week. And I'm sure that they had the opportunity to really look at some things, especially after the firing of Walt Bell and the elevation of Rod Carey to the offensive coordinator's position. Rod signing having a 2-year contract at $815K, the memorandum of understanding, and he ends up being one of the highest paid offensive coordinators in IU history. But he takes over for Walt Bell. Also announced over the weekend, Justin Fuente, the former head coach at Memphis and Virginia Tech, a very good offensive mind, was added to the Hoosier staff in Rod Carey's old position. So Justin will be a great voice in that offensive staff room for him to really be able to provide some sounding board material to Rod Carey and the rest of those coaches, having the former head coaching experience and having some really good offenses at Memphis. And don't forget, Rod Carey himself had some really good offenses back when he was at Northern Illinois. So I believe that to be a good hire and a good addition. And again, I would say this past week or the last 2 weeks, Indiana has done a really good, probably did a really good job of going in and really analyzing offense, defense, and special teams from a self-scout perspective, where they really focused on themselves. And having been in some of those meetings over my years in college football, you better check your ego at the door when things aren't going right. And even some cases when things are going right, because if your position is not performing up to par, you need to week probably they probably got some actual on field time before they probably gave them some time off. And during bye weeks, it's also a good idea to let those that are bumped up and bruised and things of that nature, to try to get them back to as much as full strength as humanly possible before heading out and doing a little recruiting and looking at some of the area kids that you need to keep an eye on or see play in person for the next year or two in your recruiting classes. A little bit later on, we're going to have Zach Osterman from the Indy Star. He will join us and talk about Rod Carey, the hire, and then, of course, the addition of Justin Fuente, as well as what takeaways he took from today's presser down on IU's campus for the Tom Allen Normal Monday presser, to get some of his feedback on that as well, and some other things that he may have to add on top of what Indiana is facing with this Michigan team this week. A defense that they're going to go against is probably the top defense in the conference, only giving up 6.7 points a game, and then an offense that's hitting on all cylinders with J.J. McCarthy at the helm. So we'll have Zach joining us here in just a moment. And to give that time to happen. We're going to step away and pay some bills right now. We'll be back with the Hoosier Leave Network. And joining me now is Zach Osterman from the Indianapolis Star. And Zach, I guess the first question that I wanted to ask you today, I know that today's the typical presser down there at Indiana, and I know Coach Allen talked this morning. Anything that he brought up in that presser and in the context that maybe was anything new to the floor, or pretty much same old that you get pretty much on every Monday press conference?
Yeah, I mean, it was our first chance to talk to him about the switch to Rod Carey. He made a statement before introducing Rod last week when when Rod Carey met with us after becoming offensive coordinator. But it was our first chance to really kind of quiz Tom Allen on it, and also I think probably a more opportune time than it would have been last week, in the sense that last week was the bye week. Coaches are always in and out of town during the bye week. It's a time to go recruiting. It's a time when practice, is just a little bit kind of different, a little bit sort of more chopped up. I think he probably echoed a lot of the things Rod Carey said last week. Nobody's expecting miracles with this switch, this offensive coordinator switch mid-season. There won't be any, dramatic formation changes. Indiana's not going to suddenly run an entirely new playbook. There's just not time to install all that. I think what he really sort of parroted Tom Allen was kind of this idea, Rod Carey said it in a very sort of simple way, but just this idea of sort of trying to identify, okay, these are things that we can do well offensively. Let's build the foundation around them and then move forward from there, and try to cut out maybe some of the stuff that maybe Indiana had been trying to do and just hadn't found a way to get it to work. Allen did emphasize that Taven Jackson is still Indiana's starting quarterback, which I think was a question we had after the Maryland game when he made that quarterback switch in the second half, and then, could easily have poured water on the idea that was anything more than just kind of getting your starters out of the game once it was decided. It really didn't. But I think more than anything, it's just kind of listening to, Tom Allen talk about being on the same page with Rod Carey, getting to know him this last year and a half. I don't think they really had any enormous pre-existing relationship before Carey came on staff last year as a quality control analyst. But Carey spent, it's relevant to say, a lot of last season in Indiana's defensive room, basically as sort of like an offensive mind looking at a defense, or an offensive mind sort of presenting, sort of some scouting thoughts and maybe an offense the defense is preparing for. So they haven't gotten to know each other pretty well. Of course, Tom Allen called Indiana's defense last season, so he would have been really hands-on in those meetings. But I think, what it really is, and I don't even know, other than maybe a couple injury questions, if Tom Allen got a question today about anything other than something around the offensive coordinator change. And that's clearly just kind of, first on the list for Indiana football at the moment.
Yeah, I would imagine that there's that discussion too, a little bit with the change, and that's kind of the what is on the forefront of everybody's mind at this point in time. One thing that I was not surprised by, but the decision to go ahead and give a 2-year contract with $815,000 as a base salary for Rod Carey. Kind of, what's your thought process on that as it pertains to making him one of the highest paid offensive coordinators in, I guess, Indiana history?
He is, he's the highest paid coordinator in terms of guaranteed salary Indiana's ever had. And that's offense or defense. Now, that doesn't factor in bonuses and things like that. And I think, for example, Kalen DeBoer's 1 year at Indiana would have paid out more when you brought those things in. Listen, it's interesting. It hasn't come without some criticism, although, to be fair, when you're a coach whose team has been struggling for the last 3 years, you could hand out free ice cream and people would probably find some reason why it's reflective of your tactical and moral failings as a head coach. What I would say is, I think there was this question of, I know there was this question, and I understand it. Why not wait until the offseason? Why not take the job into the coaching market? If you're going to offer a robust salary anyway, why not see what a national search yields you? And I would say a few things. Number one, I do think Rod Carey has the sort of resume where if he hadn't been in Indiana as an analyst already, if he'd been working somewhere else, let's say as offensive line coach, and Indiana had done that and had hired him in January, I think people would have been intrigued by the hire, not necessarily obviously his time at Temple, but before that, his years at Northern Illinois, he was integral both as offensive coordinator and as head coach in building some really, really good offenses, particularly some really good sort of ground-based offenses. I think a lot of quarterback run element in those when you think back to the Jordan Lynch type QBs he had there. Number two, not wanting to be dismissive of that argument, I would point out, even if Indiana is offering a substantial amount of money, at least relative to its own history, to this next coordinator, whoever he would be in this hypothetical, that coordinator can read the room as well as anybody else. Coaches understand, what things look like. And if you're hiring a guy who might look at you as a head coach and say, geez, things haven't really turned around. Like let's say, for example, he elevates Rod Carey just as the interim offensive coordinator. Things don't really get turned around. Indiana slumps to finish the season. Any coach Indiana interviews is going to understand that, that basically everybody having a job by the end of next season might come down to their performance. And that's not that coaches don't shy away from pressure, but that's kind of an extreme situation to step into. And to be clear, I'm not speculating anything. This is not me, so no one's whispered in my ear or whatever. But I mean, there's been enough discussion of just the way Tom Allen's contract works and the way his buyout works that everybody, sometimes fans treat buyouts like coaches aren't aware of them and they've just sort of discovered them. And it's sort of like, listen, everybody knows how that business works. Everyone understands just the nature and some of the peril, frankly, at times of that industry and that profession. And so if you went into, the winter, I'm not hugely convinced that you would, without maybe offering even substantially more money than Indiana already has handed out to Rod Carey. I don't know, what your candidate pool would look like, I guess. And then the third thing I would say is you've got a coach here who was your interim offensive line coach for the second half of last season. He switched over from working with Indiana's defense last season to working with Indiana's offense this season. So he's a lot more, he joked that when he stepped into the offensive line room last year, he only knew numbers, not names, because he'd spent all his time thinking about the defense. That's not the case now. He has been on the offensive side of the ball pretty much all year. He's going to have a working knowledge, of course, of the structure of the playbook and also, though, of the personnel, what's at his disposal. Maybe he might have even some of those ideas about, well, these are some of the things that I think actually we maybe should be leaning more heavily into because we're good at this or we're good at that. And so then maybe under I guess an optimist scenario, the process of restarting or rebuilding this offense begins earlier. And maybe you get some results out of that. It's worth saying that, Indiana's got, it's kind of into the fire here. These first 3 weeks, you're facing the top two scoring defenses in the country in Michigan and Penn State. But in the same breath, you have a Rutgers team that's incredibly run heavy. You got an Illinois team that's one of only two teams beneath you in points per game, scoring offense. And I know sometimes that's a bit of a blunt instrument statistic, but the point is it's an Illinois team that struggles to score the football. Michigan State's got its issues. Purdue's got its issues. If you can affect some change and some positive improvement in this offense, then it's not hard to see Indiana competing for some of these games of the back half of the schedule that we've always talked about being really important to, kind of maybe Indiana realizing some of its opportunities as a bowl team. And one way or the other, you're putting that offensive coordinator at, you're giving him an extra 2.5, 3 months to kind of start the process of evaluating and improving that offense, in addition to, truly an entire offseason. So I sort of understand how Allen wound up here in a variety of different ways. It is a big dice roll for him, but, any coordinator hire would have been, frankly. And like I said, it's I don't think he and Carey really knew each other before Carey got to IU, but I think it's clear that the rapport and the relationship they've built over the last couple of years is strong. And again, I understand how he got to this decision.
Yeah, I understand too. And I get you on the 1 year deal type of scenario where your pool of applicants is probably not going to be overly strong in that situation. Maybe getting a guy and Virginia Tech head coach has been hired in Coach Carey's previous role as an offensive quality control coach. Personally, I think it's a great hire because he has a pretty good offensive mind with him, and I think he'll be a good addition in that staff room. But any takeaways from that over this during the presser?
Tom Allen, I think, couldn't address that just because, I mean, this, universities have layer upon layer of human resources bureaucracy, and this has been cleared, but that hasn't been cleared. So it's not, I guess the point is, it wasn't official enough to be talked about yet. But I think, to your point, it is interesting. I understand these quality control positions have kind of become a nice little sort of on ramp back into coaching when coaches get fired or coaches get let go. Sometimes even when maybe, I mean, like Matt Guerrieri, Indiana's defensive coordinator, wasn't fired, outright. He was just let go as part of a staff that was turned over at Duke. And so then he spent a year at Ohio State as a QC guy or something. If it wasn't that, it was a very similar role. But I mean, it probably speaks well of Indiana that it can get someone with Justin Fuente's resume. And I think, as much as anything else too, I think it also speaks to what Tom Allen wants out of that, that role. I always think back to, Tom Crean, really valued assistants with head coaching experience. And I think that one of the big reasons why he did was because at any given time, he might need to say, hey, I got to drop this. I got to go, make an unplanned recruiting trip, or, I think I need to spend today working, really zeroing in on just one thing within this team that's only going to be a small handful of players. I need you to run everything else for a day, or I need you to handle the rest of practice on your own, that kind of thing. And of course, those two positions aren't exactly one to one. I understand that. But I think it tells you something when a head coach seeks out other head coaches in that kind of role and can get other head coaches, because as you said, that was Rod Carey's position before he was elevated. And so, it's multiple head coaches with success on their resumes at different stops who've now kind of filled that role. And I think, again, it says something about Tom Allen when, he can convince those guys that that's a good opportunity for them as well. So, it probably is in the broadest possible terms, when you're talking about quality control, it's probably one of those where if you're doing your job right, you're very behind the scenes, even if you are someone who's obviously prominent name wise within college football recently. But I don't think there's any real downside, certainly, to Justin Fuente coming on board at Indiana. I'd heard that was the likeliest sort of outcome when Carey was elevated, because obviously Indiana wasn't going to leave that QC position open. But I think it probably says something that that's the caliber of coach or talent or football mind, whatever term you want to use, that you can attract to a job like that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I want to appreciate you for kind of giving me some of your insights into this change over here the last couple of weeks. Hoosiers will take on a very tough and really good Michigan team this Saturday up in Ann Arbor. And I'm sure you'll be traveling up there. Make sure you bring a little extra winter clothing because it is October now. But really appreciate you jumping on here today, Zach, and we'll catch you. That was Zach Osterman from the Indianapolis Star. Appreciate him joining us here today on the Hoosier Football Tailgate here on the Believe Network, sponsored by Bet Online. Bet Online is where the game starts, and changing some things over here, but really appreciate and value Zach's opinions on some of the changes down there at Bloomington over the week. A couple things on Justin Fuente and what he kind of brings to that room, and what he'll probably be in task doing is really making sure that the offensive staff stays on task with doing the things that work, and maybe finding ways to add wrinkles. And then, of course, being a guy that can provide them information on the defenses that they'll be facing, because the next 3 weeks, you got Michigan, of course, Saturday, Penn State coming up, and then you got Rutgers, I believe, in between those two. So that Rutgers game, as I would hate to put too much emphasis on the game as it stands now, but that's a critical game for the Hoosiers to try to get themselves potentially bowl eligible. They need a win there, of course, to help that case along. And I know some people may have some questions about, how can they go out and hire Justin Fuente in terms of payment and stuff. More than likely, Justin is probably getting paid from Virginia Tech, and whatever he's making at Indiana will be just subtracted from what Virginia Tech has to pay him. More times than not, the head coaches are the ones that are taken care of in these contract situations. Most assistant coaches nowadays get a 2-year deal, which is pretty nice. Some get 3. Back when I was coaching, we got 1-year deals, and our contracts expired February. So if you got let go, you had 6 months. You knew you had 6 months to find a job. So, but I think, like I said, good hire there by Coach Allen and his. And for the offensive staff there, and of course with Rod Carey as it pertains to him. I think what Zach was trying to say there is, if they would have not made Rod the full-time offensive coordinator, the potential to bring in somebody with value with 1 year remaining on the head coach's contract would have been a little bit more difficult when it pertains to the pool of applicants for those type of jobs. And more than likely, the only way they would be able to bring them in would be on a 1-year deal. And I don't think too many guys out there would jump on that, and unless it was the last thing on earth that they had to jump on. But we shall see. I'll be back here on Thursday to do the Michigan game. I thought maybe I'd get to some of that today, but I'm going to put that off until Thursday and kind of get back on a normal week here with me having videos and on Mondays and Thursdays. And again, thanks to Bet Online for their sponsorship of the Hoosier Football Tailgate here on the Believe Network. Remember, go over to betonline.ag. Use the promo code BELIEVE, BLEAV. Get 50% on your first deposit with Believe or with betonline.ag. BetOnline is where the game starts. Well, thanks again for joining us here this afternoon here on our Hoosier Football Tailgate. We'll see you on Thursday. I'm the coach, Shannon Griffith. You have a great evening.